My goal is to tell you something that you don't already know about Hamilton the musical and about Alexander Hamilton the guy. Well, here's an opening. I grew up in Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah. We had the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and Donny and Osmond and a very LDS-influenced state legislature. And what we did not have was an underground hip-hop scene. If you would have approached me in the year 1994, the last year that I lived there, and you would have told me that the following had happened, I would have bet you everything I own that it was wrong or that this would never come to pass or that you were making something up because this was just too crazy. There is no way that this could possibly have happened. But here we are from the book Historians on Hamilton, chapter 14, quote, consider the following. On March 9th, 2016, Utah State Senator Jim Dabakis, an openly gay Democrat and founder of an advocacy group called Utah Progressives, and Utah State Representative Ken Ivory, a conservative Republican best known for urging state officials to seize federal land, donned 18th-century costumes to extol the virtues of Hamilton and their fellow lawmakers. With Dabakis dressed as King George III and Ivory as Hamilton, they urged their peers to pass a resolution honoring Lin-Manuel Miranda and his historically inspired musical. Despite their many political disagreements, these legislators' love of Hamilton had brought them together. Their resolution praised the musical for capturing the human drama, intrigue, passion, perplexity, and promise of America's founding in a way that resonates with a modern and ethnically diverse America. And for captivating audiences regardless of economic circumstances or political stances, the resolution easily passed in both the House and the Senate and was quickly signed into law by Utah's Republican Governor, Gary Herbert. And, quote, that to me is mind-blowing that such a thing could happen. I would not have expected that. And I want to tell you some more things that you don't want to expect. So we're going to start today with the most basic history about Alexander Hamilton. And I'm pretty sure that at least once during this episode, I can tell you something you didn't know, or at least get you to think about Hamilton in a different way in this, our first Hamilton episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. All right, just a little quick piece of bookkeeping. As always, I just wanted to tell you how thankful I am that you're listening to this podcast. I really enjoy making it, and it's only worth doing if there are some people out there that are willing to listen to it, and you're one of them. So thank you so much. The show will need to grow to keep going, and we're hoping at some point it could become economically self-sufficient. So anything you can do to help with that, telling a friend, reposting it on your social media, that is super helpful. At this point, we're not asking you for your money, but giving me a little bit of a boost of your time would sure mean a lot. Okay. And just the other bit of bookkeeping is we are starting Hamilton. This is going to be at least 12 episodes. There is so much stuff out there. You know, when I talked about Les Mis and when we talked about the Man of La Mancha, Don Quixote, I said, truthfully, look, there is no way you're going to cover everything that has ever been written about Don Quixote. And so I'm just going to kind of make sporadic decisions about what it is I cover and don't cover. That is almost more true of Hamilton. I mean, there's just so much source material that's come out since the show got released in 2015, 2016, that there's just no way I'm going to keep up with all of it. But I am going to do the deepest dive I can on as many of the important topics as we can get to. So today we're just going to start with the basics about the history and life of Alexander Hamilton. Now, if you've seen the musical and you think, all right, I already know all this stuff, this is going to be boring, I'll promise you, I'll bet that by the time we are done, hopefully less than an hour from now, you are going to think about Alexander the human in a slightly different way. And there will be some stuff that we talk about with the show and the way he's presented in the musical that makes you go, oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it, but that is kind of the point that they're trying to make in the show. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to divide this episode into two parts. The first is what you already know about Hamilton from watching the musical or memorizing the soundtrack or watching it on Disney or however you encountered it. But if you're here, I assume that you've probably seen the show. And then the second thing we'll talk about is what you need to know about Hamilton that you might not really get if all you did was watch the show. And if anything, I'll just say Hamilton is an even more impressive guy than he is in the show if you just look at what he has done historically. All right. So what you need to know about Hamilton the musical, and here most of what I'm taking is cribbed from Ariel Narenson, who was writing in the American Quarterly in December of 2016. So that was just after the show opened on Broadway. Narenson is currently an associate professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of Buffalo. Okay, so the first thing that everybody knows about Hamilton and the musical is that the source for that was Chernow, who wrote the book on Hamilton. Chernow is an author and probably a researcher, at least as much of a researcher as I am for this podcast, but is not a professional historian. Okay, so when I do a podcast, I get all the information out there, including all the academic research. I read through as much of it as seems sensible and time permitting, at least until I feel like if I'm saying something to be true, I know that it actually is. But I would not say that I am a scholar of any of these topics or that I have a PhD for sure, but it's not a PhD in theater. And this podcast, as much as I enjoy it, is not professional scholarship. I am a scholar of pretrial publicity. And so if I do research on that, I go out, I get approval from my institutional review board. I design a study. I collect the data. I analyze the data. I write it up in a 25-page academic article. I submit it for peer review. And that I consider significant scholarship. Okay, so Chernow is sort of like the version of me who does the podcast. That is, listens to, does a ton of research. And let's be honest here, Chernow did way more research for his book, which is 800 pages long, than I have done for this podcast. But not as much as I would do, for example, my research on pretrial publicity or any of the other topics that I publish on. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. Chernow is a significant figure, but not a professional historian, and has a take on Hamilton. But everybody agrees it's a pretty favorable take, and maybe an unduly favorable take, or at least there are professional historians that think that maybe he's not quite telling the whole story. We are going to get to all the details. I'm going to mention a couple today. We'll get to the big ones, like was Hamilton a slave owner? That's a ball of wax, a can of worms, ball of string, something that can unravel for a really long time. We'll get to that in subsequent episodes. Today, I'm just going to kind of highlight some of it. But all right, I'm going to walk you through Hamilton, the musical, and what we've learned about Alexander Hamilton in that show. I'm going to highlight kind of what it is you probably take away from it. And then what I think the show's direction, like its purpose is. And then that'll kind of prime us so that in the future, when we start doing deep dives on things, we can remember back to this episode to give us all context. Okay, the show starts in Act 1. Alexander Hamilton arrives in the United States as an immigrant. He comes from the Caribbean, an island called St. Nevis, Nevis. He is young. He is scrappy. He is hungry. His island has been destroyed. His island has a bunch of poverty and a bunch of slavery. But after a hurricane, the people of the island notice that he's really bright. They take up a collection and get some money, and they send him to the United States. There's more to it than that, but that is kind of how the show opens. There he meets John Laurens, Hercules Mulligan, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Aaron Burr. Among them, Laurens is a very strong abolitionist, and as these men are getting together and talking, they are very aware of their place in history. They know that we're at a city where important stuff is happening, and we are here to be part of that. They all then join the revolution. They meet George Washington, and Hamilton becomes a key Washington advisor. Now, Washington plays the role of the elder statesman, kind of that mentor. If this were a hero's journey, and it isn't quite, Washington would be the mentor that Hamilton meets. And he kind of presages what's going to happen. He talks about, the quote from the show is, dying is easy, living is harder. And so what we see of Alexander Hamilton in the first act is he's this young, super aggressive, super smart guy who wants the revolution, but the wiser Washington says, all right, but Cool your jets. This is actually something we have talked about in this podcast before. The important thing that winning a revolution, that's no small thing, right? You got to do that. Most revolutions fail. If you got a revolution that wins, that's great. But your success is probably going to be based mostly on what happens after the revolution and how well you create your new system of government or your new country or your new nation, your new body politic. That's really going to be the important thing. And Washington knows that at the start of Act One, and Hamilton does not yet know that. Okay, so along the way, we meet the three Schuyler sisters. Angelica, the oldest, has a crush on Alexander, but he marries Elizabeth, the second daughter, and the third one is Peggy. Now, there's some romantic tension there, but everybody seems to resign that Alexander and Eliza belong together. Angelica, as the firstborn, has to marry rich, and Angelica, has the hots for Alexander. He's probably got the hots for her. But she realizes that Alexander and Eliza can be happy together, and Angelica is mostly happy for them. Alexander Burr, meanwhile, has an affair with Theodosia Prevost, the wife of a British officer. And then as they start progressing in their revolutionary history, one of the things that happens is that there's a General Charles Lee. He lost the Battle of Monmouth. He pooped the bed is the phrase. They use a stronger word than pooped. But if I say that, they're going to block me on YouTube. But see, Charles Lee loses the Battle of Monmouth, is probably cowardly about it, but he blames George Washington. Dude, why are you doing that? So Lawrence challenges Lee to a duel. And the song they sing is the 10 Duel Commandments. How are you supposed to behave during a duel? Now, this is a clear reference if you didn't know, and I honestly did not until I started reading up on this. It's a reference to the 10 Crack Commandments by the notorious B.I.G. So Lin-Manuel Miranda, the author, is putting together, obviously, a hip-hop musical and is making a callback to Notorious B.I.G's thing, when he's using that 10 dueling commandments thing. Anyway, Hamilton is Lauren's second, and that creates some tension. That's something, you really don't want to have your generals and your other officers shooting at each other. But Hamilton is there. He sees what dueling is. He sees what dueling is like. And Washington and Hamilton then spat over the duel. And Hamilton goes back into the fighting service with the Marquis de Lafayette, and they all win at Yorktown in the year 1781. So that kind of ends the Revolutionary War period. Hamilton and Washington are besties, but they have a split over the dueling practice. But everybody behaves heroically except for General Charles Lee. And at Yorktown, the British are defeated. We now have a new republic. As that's going on in their personal lives, Hamilton and Burr both have kids. Hamilton has a son named Philip, and Burr has a daughter named Theodosia. Uncreatively enough, same name as the mother. And then as that's going on, Lawrence dies in a totally pointless battle. Burr and Hamilton both becomes lawyers, and Hamilton then starts arguing for the Constitution in the Federalist Papers with James Madison and John Jay, and it works. We have a Constitution now, but it does go by pretty quick. There's almost more time spent on the duel in which Lawrence did not die. And there's more about just kind of the younger men being young and aggressive in New York than there is about Alexander Hamilton writing the Federalist Papers and getting the Constitution put through. But it does accurately say that he did so with James Madison and John Jay. As that's going down, Angelica, the oldest Schuyler sister, departs for London. Washington becomes president. And when we end, Alexander is the secretary of the Treasury. Eliza takes a look around and begs him to slow down and say, hey, I know you're young, scrappy, and hungry and all, but there's a lot going on. And isn't this enough? Here you are. We got a new government. You're doing a lot as the secretary of Treasury. Why don't you try to spend a little more time on your domestic life? And that ends Act One. And so what Professor Narrison has to say is that Act One is mostly about the revolution coming in and succeeding. And then Act Two is about trying to govern once the British have been kicked out. All right, so we start Act Two. Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's lifelong antagonist, gets home from France, and there are rap battles in the cabinet about Hamilton's financial proposals and other stuff. It's basically Jefferson and Madison versus Hamilton. And so interesting note there that Madison is writing the Federalist Papers with Hamilton, but when Jefferson gets there and when Washington is the president, they are on the opposite side of what Hamilton wants to do. The new government's being formed. It's super time consuming. Eliza decides she's going to head upstate to spend a summer with Angelica, who's coming back to visit from the UK. And while she's gone, Alexander Hamilton has an affair with Maria Reynolds, dude. But everybody sort of agrees, not Alexander Hamilton's finest moment. We will get more into Maria Reynolds in coming episodes. There is a significant dinner. Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison reach a compromise at a private dinner, the room where it happens, to pass Hamilton's financial plan in exchange for the capital going near the Potomac River. So where is this government going to have its new capital? Well, Hamilton, of course, wants it in New York, but says, I will let you have it right near the Potomac, where it is now in Washington, D.C., if you will let my economic proposals pass. We assume, because nobody really knows what really happened in there, because that was the room where it happened. And the point of the whole thing is that Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison are doing the talking, but Aaron Burr pointedly is not. And that makes him jealous. So Burr decides he's going to switch parties and run against Alexander's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, his wife's dad, runs against him in a Senate race, and Aaron Burr wins. Okay, so the Aaron Burr that was chilling in the tavern in Act 1 has now become a nemesis. Actually, so have Jefferson and so has Madison. It's not really clear. So Alexander is now getting some enemies. All right. Hamilton then talks to Washington about staying neutral in this UK-France war, which is kind of weird for the dude who loves Lafayette, right? Like if Hamilton's like, Lafayette's the guy, he's my fellow immigrant, we get it done in the time period after the U.S. Revolutionary War. The French Revolution happens right around 1792, and then between 1792 and 1800, France and the UK are on the high seas, and the U.S. has got to decide, what are we going to do? And of course, one obvious thing is France backed us against Britain in our Revolutionary War, so now's the time where France needs our help to back their new revolutionary government after the UK. Well, Jefferson and Madison and Burr all want to back France, but Hamilton thinks it is not prudent, and he talks Washington into staying neutral. And so now Jefferson, Madison, and Burr are all mad at him. In fact, they want to politically bury him. Okay. Washington now retires at long last. John Adams is now president. Hamilton and Washington get together and they write a speech about how important it is to keep the Union together, to keep a strong central government. But that is merely a speech. It's not a policy action that anyone has taken. Washington goes ahead and retires, and John Adams is now president. He fires Hamilton, who has published some nasty things about John Adams. And now Jefferson and Madison and Burr go for the kill with the Reynolds affair, and they accuse Hamilton of embezzling funds to cover it up. They say that Hamilton was getting blackmailed by Reynolds' husband and that he paid it off with state funds. Hamilton is going to try to get out in front of it by admitting to the affair, but saying that he paid everything that he paid in the Reynolds affair came from his own private funds. Now, that does solve the problem of having behaved illegally, but it does kind of end him politically. That is, he still is kind of a political insider, and we'll talk in just a sec about his role in the Federalist Party, but it's going to be hard for him to get elected office. As you might expect, Eliza is not especially happy that Alexander's had an affair with Reynolds, and so she burns all of his love letters. Nasty things are said about Alexander by lots of people. Philip, Alexander's son, decides that he's going to defend his father's honor, decides to hold a duel. They have to do it in New Jersey. Philip is shot, and he dies. That is, of course, a cause of great sorrow to Alexander and Eliza, and they eventually reconcile. Okay. This is all happening kind of quick, right? So this is about a 5-6 year period, but we get to the presidential election of 1800, and there's this weird tie between Jefferson and Burr. That is, that Jefferson's supposed to be the president and Burr is supposed to be the vice president, but because of a weird tie in the Electoral College, they can't just resolve it that way. And Burr, instead of saying, okay, cool, Thomas, you be the president, he wants to do it instead. So Hamilton talks to his friends in the Federalist Party and convinces them to back Jefferson, which hacks off Burr. Burr now has two things to be mad about. Burr was opposed by Hamilton's father-in-law. The two of them see opposite on a bunch of issues, but now in the view of Burr, Hamilton has just cost him the presidency in the year 1800. They then exchange hostile letters, and there's a challenge to a duel as a result. Hamilton, of course, famously loses that duel. He is shot. In the play, he kind of throws his shot away. His advice to Philip was, all you're really there is to prove that you were willing to shoot each other, but don't actually shoot each other. That's not what Burr's thinking. Burr shoots Hamilton. Hamilton is hit, and he dies. And then as the play ends, as the musical ends, everyone reflects on Hamilton's legacy. And Eliza then, at the end of the show, spends her next 50 years preserving the memory of Alexander Hamilton. So that's quite a reversal for her from having burned all of her correspondence with Alexander Hamilton to then kind of dedicating the next 50 years of her life. He was 47 when he died, and she's almost the same age, but she goes on to live another 50 years. So the big historical question is, what would Alexander Hamilton have done if he would have had 50 more years? He was only halfway there, right? At 47, he still had another 4 to 5 decades to do stuff, but didn't because he died in the duel. Eliza spent her next 4 to 5 decades preserving the life of her fallen husband, Alexander Hamilton. All right, and that is how the show ends. Okay, so what are the big points you might take away from that, or at least the way that it's been presented on the stage? Well, you would probably notice that Hamilton was an immigrant. They make a point out of that quite a bit. You would know that he was definitely a confidant of George Washington. You would know that he was a war hero, especially in the Battle of Yorktown. You would know that he had some financial ideas, but you might not know exactly what those were. They were at odds with slavery, and depending on how closely you listened to those cabinet rap battles, you might have picked up on what they were or what they weren't. They do seem important, and there is comment that they were significant and that other people disagreed with them and tried to kill him, but they couldn't. But I don't know that you would say this was a show about Alexander Hamilton and the impact that he had on Wall Street and his big financial ideas. The big moment comes when the compromise in the room where it happens. So you would think, all right, the thing that defined Alexander Hamilton is he had this big compromise. And I guess you would know that that launched his economic policies, but it was not clear to me, at least when I watched the show, was that a big deal? Like, what was the big deal about the room where it happened? Like, in the show, the big deal about the room where it happens is Aaron Burr is left out, and that hacks him off, and that eventually results in the duel. But the actual compromise is like, well, I mean, I guess it's important to know that Washington, D.C. is Washington, D.C. because of that meeting, but would the world be all that different if it was in New York City or Albany or wherever it is that might otherwise have been? And it's true, we wouldn't have had Alexander Hamilton's economic policies without that compromise, but how big a deal is that? I don't know that you would come away from the show with a strong sense of it. You might know it, but you wouldn't have a strong sense of it. What you would know for sure, though, was that he had an affair that blew him up politically and had a huge toll on his personal life. And you would know that he died in a duel with Aaron Burr. Those are the things you can't miss about the show. All right. So you come away from the show and you're like, hey, who's Alexander Hamilton? And you say he was an immigrant. He was a confidant of Washington. He was a war hero. He was a politician. He had some personal life tragedy and was a complicated guy and found himself in conflicts with other people, but was a mover and shaker. And with the big thing about him was he had an outsized impact on the development of the United States at a key moment in its history, and outsized based on where he started life as sort of a completely anonymous kid growing up in an obscure Caribbean island. Okay, those are the big takeaway things. You watch the show and you walk out of the theater and you're like, man, I'm fired up about Alexander Hamilton. And those are now things I know about him that I didn't know before I walked in the show. Well, there are definitely historical quibbles. So there's a bunch of stuff in there that was not 100% accurate and was changed for the sake of the show. Joanne Freeman of Yale, and I'll give her a better introduction later, but is writing in a journal called Journal of the Early Republic. And here is her quote, Hamilton's opinion didn't decide the presidential election of 1800. Burr's loss of that election didn't lead to their duel, and Burr and Hamilton didn't bump up against each other as often or as meaningfully as the play suggests, end quote. And there's something to that. I mean, he probably did bump up against Jefferson quite a bit, but he didn't die in a duel with Jefferson. So I guess that, when Lin-Manuel Miranda took a look at it, he said, that's the relationship I've got to develop. There is another author named Lyra Monteiro who also is going to get a bigger introduction later. Here is her quote, an early scene in a tavern where the Marquis de Lafayette, Aaron Burr, Hamilton, John Lawrence, and Hercules Mulligan meet could never have happened, end quote. There are other historical inaccuracies. There were a lot more Shilohlers than 3. I think there were actually 8 of them. Some of them didn't survive, though. Yorktown was the battle at which we defeated the British, but it was actually a retreat. You wouldn't necessarily know that from watching the show. It was a decisive battle, but the U.S. was actually retreating. The Reynolds pamphlet, the thing where Alexander Hamilton admitted his affair with Reynolds, the authenticity of that document has been questioned. It's taken as read that there really was an affair, and the musical takes as read that there really was an affair, and that Hamilton really was in the wrong, and that he really did get out in front of it by publishing that pamphlet. But others have a different take on what was really going on. It's also true that the cause of the first split with Washington was probably not a duel, not that Hamilton had been the second for John Lawrence against General Lee. Okay, those are things that are not accurate, but almost everybody, like even the people who are offended by the show, all agree that that's kind of cool, right? Everybody knows you got to trim down the life of Alexander Hamilton. You got to make it fit. You got to make a good story. And you got to make some dramatic choices about what am I going to tell? How am I going to, some characters will be composites. And even the people will write, just pages and pages lambasting the treatment that Lin-Manuel Miranda and Chernow give to Hamilton. Even the people who hate it generally say those historical inaccuracies, the ones that I just talked about, those are actually not a big deal. And also, everybody kind of acknowledges it's a fabulous work of art. Just that I'll talk about that at length later. But in my opinion, if you were to read Les Miserables, it is a masterpiece because there's just so much depth at so many layers. And I think Hamilton is that. Like, the American musical is a uniquely American medium. And if you were to say, what is its masterpiece? What perfected all that? I think it'll be Hamilton, just the way the music and the choreography and message and the hip hop, the way it all comes together is just so masterfully done. And that is my opinion. Hopefully I'll convince you in the next, over the course of the next dozen or so episodes that that's the case. But I will say even the people who hate what he has to say about Hamilton and slavery and who hate the multiracial casting, they agree with that. They will say, but it is a fabulously entertaining, really great work of art. Okay. Now, here are some things that I just want to point about what Hamilton the musical is. What is it a story about? I just kind of gave you, the plot summary. And then I talked about what elements of Hamilton's life does that emphasize. But what is it? What is very conspicuously, like if you didn't overthink it, if you just said, what is the show about? Okay, well, the first thing you notice is it's not a hero's journey. It does not have a happy ending. It's closer to a tragedy. He died at the age of 47 for a totally stupid reason. Like, at best, it was a minor ego clash between two guys who should have gotten over themselves. But that duel was stupid. He should not have been in it. He should not have died. And he should not have died when he did at the age of 47. He did not get an opportunity to finish his life's work. But clearly, the audience is also intended to relate to him sympathetically. So you would think, I like this guy, but this is not a Disney happy ending. They do not end and live happily ever after. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite. He's sort of at his apex where he makes the deal in the room where it happens, and it all kind of falls apart after that. He alienates people. He is kicked out of the cabinet. He has an affair that alienates his wife, and then he dies in a duel. The ending, the last, quarter of the events that are happening to him are not happy ones. Okay, so that is the first conspicuous, undeniable element of the show. The second conspicuous, undeniable, something that is definitely front and center in the show, is it has multiracial casting, and that is clearly intended to say something about the great white male view of history. It is clear Lin-Manuel Miranda intends the multiracial casting, that is having actors of color play people who, in actuality, historically were white. He wants that to challenge the view that these great white men are the ones who make history, that the American Revolution is the story of what great white men did. And he wants to highlight that with the multiracial casting, and he wants to focus on Alexander Hamilton because if his mom was French, and his dad was Scottish, that's true. He's probably white, but, he came from this island and he was illegitimate, and that is not true of any of the other founders, or at least none of the other founders that are in that show. And so Miranda wants to make that front and center, like, hey, man, I want to put people of color in that narrative, and I'm here to disrupt it, right? I don't want us to keep thinking that the story of the American Revolution is what these great white men did. I want you to think about, I want to challenge that somehow by casting performers of color. There is a big question in there about Hamilton's association with slavery. And just to give you a flavor of how controversial Hamilton's relationship to slavery is going to be, the very first biography written by his son claimed that he never owned slaves. And that viewpoint lasted as long as his second biography, which was written by his grandson, that said that he did own slaves. That is in the show, you get the impression that Hamilton was a abolitionist or an anti-slavery crusader, or that it is acknowledged, the show tries to acknowledge, there was progress made on the front of civil rights in the American Revolution, but it obviously left people out, including women, and especially including slaves. That is a central theme of the show, is that Miranda definitely wants to challenge the great white male view of history. The main point of the show, the theme, is that history is constantly rewritten and re-remembered. The famous phrases, who lives, who dies, and who tells your story. And the big thing at the end is that Eliza is going to be the one who tries to tell Hamilton's story. But there's an implicit acknowledgement, and this is very true to history, that there were lots of people that were writing lots of history about Alexander Hamilton and all the other founders, and that history is not a static thing, that it's easy to think of history as just one fact after another fact. These things happen in this order, and that produced this outcome. But history is much more contested than that. It's much more incomplete than that. And a lot of people think it's much more living and alive than that. We're constantly finding new ways to think about history, and we're making new discoveries and that challenge the way that we remember it. Okay. And that is a theme of the show, right? It's not just that happens and we acknowledge it, but the whole kind of point of it is, what is the end of the show? Well, it's about who tells your story and how you're remembered. Washington keeps saying that. That is Eliza's main motivation. And the show itself is an attempt to retell and reimagine and recreate and reinterpret the life of Alexander Hamilton. And that can happen if history is a static thing that's just a bunch of facts. And it's kind of the main point of the show. And as I mentioned before, just about everybody agrees that it was an artistic success, even people who definitely do not agree with a multiracial casting decision, who think that he not only failed to challenge the great white male view of history, but that he might have reinforced it. Okay. The big questions of the show are over the nature of history and not really the details of Hamilton's life, but kind of the big picture. And I think Miranda wants to say, look, Hamilton was an immigrant, much, much more in this later, but Miranda is very conspicuously, but very open about it. He's from Puerto Rico, and he's got kind of this weird citizenship status and a Puerto Rican relationship to the United States, which is kind of, you belong, but not really. And I think he saw Alexander Hamilton as very much the same. You were a founder, but you didn't really belong as much as all the other founders, and they let you know about it. And kind of, as we'll figure out, he let them know about it too, in ways that aren't quite as progressive as you might think of from the show. Anyway, coming episode teaser, there we go. All right, so all of that is what you would probably take from watching the show, the history of Alexander Hamilton as portrayed in the show. What is it you would know if you didn't see the show, but you just read a book on Hamilton, or you went to a history class, or you went to the Encyclopedia Britannica page, or you were like, okay, I'm willing to believe that Hamilton was a big guy. What were his contributions? What did he do? All right. Well, I will preface all of this by saying the views of Hamilton have changed quite a bit over time and across writers. Now, that is kind of Miranda's point, but a common place that many authors allude to is that as Thomas Jefferson becomes more and more in favor, Alexander Hamilton is more and more viewed as a villain. And as Hamilton is viewed more and more in favor, Jefferson is viewed more and more as a villain. So we could take all that with a grain of salt. But I'm going to focus not on the changing history, but I'm going to focus on the very big things that are undeniable and that aren't emphasized in the show. All the things that are contested, that people fight about over Alexander Hamilton, things that are important, but there hasn't been a consensus about, those we're going to get to in coming episodes. What I'm about to tell you, the things about Alexander Hamilton's life, which in my view make him a even more impressive guy, nobody really doubts, right? It is 100% true. What I'm about to say, I will, if this were a debate round, by God, I would win the coin toss, choose the affirmative, defend this till I die, and be very confident that I could win. Okay, thing number one. Alexander Hamilton had an absolutely huge role in the formation of the United States Constitution. All right, so we beat the British, great. But as we have talked about in other episodes, the important thing is, now what do you do? Okay, now you're in charge. You got to be better than the government that you just got rid of. Well, what we had come up with at first were the Articles of Confederation, and they were obviously failing. But just because they were failing, it was like, okay, those didn't work. Let's try something else. There was going to be a big fight to get something new. What was going to replace the Articles of Confederation? That was a huge and open question. And the thing that really tipped the balance in favor of the Constitution by unanimous historical consensus was the Federalist Papers. Those were 85 different essays that Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay wrote, and it was mostly Hamilton, followed by Madison, and Jay did a little bit. And they all used a pseudonym. I think it was Publius is the way it is pronounced. But those essays were hugely influential in getting a constitution with a strong central government passed. That if you were wanting to know what was the intellectual underpinning of the U.S. Constitution, it's those documents. They were written mostly by Alexander Hamilton, who was just a huge driving force with it. Those papers are still quoted by the Supreme Court now, and they have been quoted by the Supreme Court for the last 250 years when they were trying to sit down and figure out the legislative intent, or what do we mean by the Constitution? What are the definitive documents that can tell us what the people who wrote that Constitution were thinking? Those are the Federalist Papers, and those were driven by Alexander Hamilton. And we will get to this in coming episodes, but there's some new research about the Constitutional Convention itself and the role that he played in that. As another teaser, when they got together, they were not supposed to write a constitution. They were supposed to talk about the Articles of Confederation and maybe fix them. They were not supposed to scrap them and replace them with a new constitution, but a bunch of people thought they should, maybe not even a majority, but Hamilton definitely wanted to do that, and he got himself on the committee, and then he, as much as anybody, was responsible for us replacing the Articles of Confederation with a new constitution. And isn't it kind of weird that he and Madison eventually fell out so badly that those two guys wrote those Federalist Papers, which are absolutely essential to what the Constitution means, and they finished that, and then they're like, okay, good, now let's hate each other a lot. All right, thing number one, as a huge defender of liberty and emancipation and freedom and a strong central government, Hamilton writes the Federalist Papers. Thing number two, he had a huge role in the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, if anything, were almost exactly the opposite direction. Or at least they were saying, all right, we're going to take this new powerful federal government and we're going to use it not to celebrate free speech and civil rights. We're going to use it to crush dissent. Here's kind of the whole thing. And this is just, if you want to know about Alexander Hamilton, why is that guy important? Well, he played a huge role in the Alien Sedition Acts. What are those? Okay, so the Constitution is signed in 1787. Washington then becomes president by 1789, but there aren't really political parties yet. That's 1787. But by 1794, so that's about 6-7 years later, the Democrat-Republican Party has formed with Jefferson and Madison, and the Federalist Party has formed with Hamilton and John Adams and John Jay. So Hamilton's kind of a unifying president in office, but there are definitely political parties, and Jefferson's on one side, Hamilton's on the other. That's 1794, which is also the year of the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, Hamilton is a big fan of imposing a federal tax on the citizens of this newly formed government. He wants a federal tax, which of course now we take as read, but was a novel thing at the time. Did this new government have the power to impose a tax? And what were they going to do if nobody wanted to pay it? Well, there were 500 armed opponents who did not want to pay it. Most of them were small farmers, and they were using whiskey mostly to buy as a commodity, right? Hey, you got 20 barrels of corn, I'll give you 3 barrels of whiskey for that. And Hamilton wanted to tax it. Washington used the military to go in and crush the Whiskey Rebellion, and it was very much a clear flex by the new federal government saying, we're the big player in town, we got the big stick, and if you don't want to pay your taxes, I know that we all just got excited about the Boston Tea Party and how we weren't going to pay taxes to the British, but the British are gone, and that doesn't mean you don't pay taxes anymore. We still have a government, we still have stuff we need to pay for, and you can't just not pay it if you don't want to. So that was kind of a turning point in the federal government. So then that's 1794. And then in 1796, Washington leaves office. And of course, he and Hamilton write his farewell address. And Adams and the Federalists take over. And at that time, there's that unofficial naval war with France going on, that we are still trading with Britain, even though we have split with them. And France doesn't want that to happen. So France is blocking our ships. So there's sort of an unofficial naval war with France going on. That's 1796. In 1797, that Reynolds pamphlet came out. So Hamilton now isn't going to win anything politically, but weird fact, he never did. Alexander Hamilton won a bunch of elections in New York and to state level offices, but he never got elected to any federal role. He did play a critical role in many federal positions, but in all of those, he was appointed by somebody else. So in 1797, the Reynolds pamphlet comes out. His popularity is waning more than ever. But the very next year, in 1798, he is appointed as the Inspector General of the Army, which is a real deal since there might be a war with France. And then behind the Federalists, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 get passed. There were 4 of them, and they're anti-free press and anti-immigrant. I'm just going to give you the Wikipedia entry, their paragraph. Here's the way it goes. And this is important. Just let's bear with me. Let's figure out what these Alien Sedition Acts are, because Hamilton is his political legacy. What did Alexander Hamilton do? If it's 1803 before he got shot by Aaron Burr, you're going to say, hey, what's that Hamilton guy all about? You would have said, okay, well, he was key to finding the Constitution, and he was a driving force behind the Alien and Sedition Acts. Here we go. Quote, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were 4 U.S. statutes that restricted naturalization, empowered the President of the United States to detain and deport foreigners, the original ICE, and criminalized false or malicious statements against the federal government. If you spoke out maliciously against the federal government, that was a criminal act. That was my little interpretation there, not the quote. Back to the quote. The laws were endorsed by the Federalist Party, led by President John Adams, on national security grounds in response to the later stages of the French Revolution and the ongoing disputes with the French revolutionary government, which had culminated in naval skirmishes. The prosecution of American journalists under the Sedition Act rallied support for the opposition, led by Thomas Jefferson, who defeated Adams in the presidential election of 1800. Okay, so that is, the acts are anti-immigrant, they're anti-free speech, they're the federal government cracking down, and they are so unpopular, they cost the Federalists. Now, Adams would later blame Hamilton for passing them and say, I never really wanted this. Hamilton just forced everybody to do it. Most historians think that although Adams said that's what happened, it's probably untrue, but it is true, almost certainly, that Hamilton had no problem with them. Hamilton, in fact, is, if anything, he's mad at Adams for not using them to more aggressively shut down opposition newspapers. Anyway, 1798, they pass. By 1799, the next year, Hamilton and Adams split. The Federalist Party is in trouble. They're floundering by and then, of course, Hamilton passes in 1804. By 1816, they are floundering, and by 1820, they are done. And in future episodes, we'll kind of trace where that happens. But what's the second thing that Alexander Hamilton did, that everybody agrees that he did, that was super important in the development of the country? He supported really anti-immigrant, anti-democracy, alien and sedition acts that were massively unpopular. So unpopular, they probably cost his party the election or eventually got him kicked out of the party. And when Jefferson took over, he repealed the last 3 of those acts. So there were 4 acts passed and Jefferson repealed 3 of them. Okay, that's the second thing he did. Third thing that he did, and this is the last one, is that if there's one thing I want you to take away from this podcast, Alexander Hamilton saved the country financially. Absolutely, unquestionably. The United States, as was operating under the Articles of Confederacy, had a huge debt problem, and that also included the states because there was not a ton of federal power in the Articles of Confederation. That when the war was fought, it was the state governments that were incurring the debt, and a lot of them were in some serious trouble. And in a nutshell, Hamilton had the idea of a U.S. bank getting created and taking over all of that debt. So it was going to say, whatever entity you were before and whatever debt you got during the Revolutionary War, this new federal government is going to take it on. Now, I am going to comment and say that was a huge mess and a really big problem, right? Your country's just trying to get going. The last thing you need is a huge pile of debt. In fact, arguably the French Revolution happened because the French had a huge debt problem, which they were in large part, because they had helped the United States in our revolution. But all that is to say, if you got a debt and you're trying to form a new government, you got a problem. And the guy who stepped in, who had the ideas, who got them passed, perhaps in the room that it happened, but other places too, was Alexander Hamilton. And by God, it worked. He had turned the country around. He had solved the debt problem. He had made the country financial solvent. And depending on who you read, what happens, that might mean he created Wall Street. It might mean that he started the U.S. style capitalism, which makes him partially or fully responsible for all the evils of the Industrial Revolution, or at least part of them, or just that he saved the U.S. economy, or just that he saved the debt crisis. But everyone agrees he fixed a huge debt problem and that he was sidelined by a sex scandal. Oh, interestingly, hey, can you name somebody else that happened to? Somebody who had a huge debt problem and fixed it and was then sidelined by a sex scandal? There's a little hidden quiz here right in the middle of this podcast episode. And the answer is Bill Clinton, the last U.S. president to balance the U.S. budget. He inherited debt. He left with a huge surplus. In fact, in the year 2000, they were debating how much of that money they were going to give back to the taxpayers. Can you imagine that? And of course, Clinton was sidelined by his own sex scandal. Wow. History repeats itself. Is it all connected? Yes, it is all connected. All right. So as a quick summary, he was crucial to the Constitution. He was crucial to the creation of the National Bank. He saved the country financially and almost single-handedly. And he was also a big proponent of some very anti-democratic legislation, which is now kind of a national embarrassment, although God knows that there are plenty of progressive governments who want to seize on the Sedition Act and use it to stamp out democracy. If that sounds like Alexander Hamilton is a complicated guy and his legacy is both massive and very different than you probably remember from your last history class that you took, or even different from what you learned about Alexander Hamilton by watching the musical Hamilton, then that's 100% right. And that is why I'm hoping the theme of this is that we are going to learn a ton about Alexander Hamilton, the musical, and Alexander Hamilton, the guy. And we are going to learn things that can completely change the way or open up and learn about a whole bunch of new things. Okay, so wrapping all that up, the point of this episode is that Alexander Hamilton is both better and worse than he appeared in the musical. And the point of the musical seems about showing a more complex, well-rounded, and even contradictory character who is still a guy that you want to cheer for. So what does all of that mean for how we understand Hamilton? And what does all of that mean for the show? If the show did succeed in humanizing Alexander Hamilton and reinvigorating the way that we think about that guy, but chose not to talk about some of the biggest, most important things that he did. What does that mean about the show? What sense do it make about all that? Well, you and I have got at least another 12 episodes to unravel it all, and we will be doing that in all the coming episodes of Theater, History, and Mysteries.